Allison can help remind me. After I get through the flu background, before we move into the stories, I can take any questions. And then after that, I can take questions at the end, and you can just put them in the chat. So go ahead, Allison.
Great. Well, we're so happy to have Lori Lynn with us tonight to do this event. We're excited to hear all about these stories. And as many of you may know, the Somerville Museum is on Central Street, and we've been in business since the 1920s. However, obviously, we've been affected like many other nonprofits because of COVID-19. So we have set up a GoFundMe page. And for anybody who is interested in donating to help us continue doing programs like this virtually, please feel free. I'm going to put the link in the chat room as well. We really appreciate it. You can also join our mailing list by going to our website, follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And we have a lot of events coming up that we've been working really hard on to keep our programming dynamic through all of this craziness. So we really appreciate you all participating and joining us tonight, and we're happy to have you.
Thank you. Okay, so let's jump right in. So a little flu 101 for the regular flu. Incubation period is usually 24 to 72 hours, meaning that you've gotten the bug, it's in your body for between 1 to 3 days before you're having symptoms. When you get the flu nowadays, and most days except for 1918, there's a complete recovery within 10 days. And even the last couple, so I've been giving this talk for about 2 years, and the last 2 flu seasons have been pretty bad. And a few people have come up to me and said, yeah, I've never been so sick in my life, even though I got the flu shot. So it's not always, but usually it's a complete recovery within 10 days. And in general, of those who get the flu, the mortality rate's about 0.1%, meaning that 1 in 1,000 people who get the flu will die. That's still a sizable amount though. Over the past 20 to 30 years, somewhere between 12,000 to 56,000 die each year from the flu, and usually from its complications, from pneumonia, which is a complication. That's usually what kills people. And 2017 to 2018 was a particularly bad year where 80,000 people in the US died. I don't have the numbers for last year, but that was also a bad year. And so now we're moving on to the flu pandemic. So there were 3 waves. The first wave was in the spring in 1918, and there's some, I don't know if controversy is the right word, but it's unclear where the flu started. Some people think that it started in Kansas, and that's what I'll be talking about tonight. Some people theorize it started in France, and others theorize it started in China. And I didn't know this, but many people from China came to help, not fight, but to do a lot of the work in the trenches, the cleaning, the digging, or whatever it is that they would do for the British. But so one of the more popular theories is that in January and February of 1918 in Haskell County, Kansas, that the county doctor there, Lorraine Miner, noticed that there were there were more flu cases than normal, and with maybe a perhaps slightly higher mortality and a few unusual symptoms. It caught his eye enough that he actually wrote to the US government, to the health reports, but no one else really noticed too much. And this was during World War I. So soldiers that were home in Haskell County went to Camp Funston, which was maybe 300 miles away, and that was one of the army camps. And soon after that, there was an outbreak where several hundred people got sick, but nobody died, or maybe only 2 or 3 people died. So there was some stuff going on in the spring. It actually did make its way over to France and to Europe. And some people say it actually may have affected the outcome of the war, not because so many people were dying, because it was just a mild illness, but it was a very contagious illness. So a lot of people on both the Allied side and the German side were dying. I mean, they were not dying, they were sick, and they were out and unable to fight for a little bit. Where it really became bad, though, was in the fall of 1918. And with that, it happened almost simultaneously in 3 places: in Boston, in France, and in Sierra Leone. And this was the second wave. So the first wave, most people didn't even know that there was a wave, the first wave. The second wave is when everybody knew and where most of the deaths occurred. And that was in the fall of 1918, late August. A few of the soldiers in the Boston area were sick. It soon spread into the community, and then from there it spread across the US. It actually spread throughout the world very quickly. Almost everywhere in the world was affected. Even places that had very severe quarantines in place, like Australia, they were okay until they lifted the quarantines, and then it came. So it really did go everywhere, even to my mom's little tiny remote village in New Mexico, which we will talk about later. And then it went away for a little bit, and then it came back in the winter and spring of 1919, maybe a little bit in 1920, and then it was gone, and it hasn't been back. But it did go everywhere. It was extremely virulent or contagious. About a third of the world was infected with the flu, which is a really, really high percent. And so worldwide, from the 1918 flu pandemic, there were 50 to 100 million deaths. In the US, there were about 675,000 deaths, which is probably an undercount because not every death was recorded. Again, a lot of the people who died of the flu that was secondary, died of pneumonia that was secondary to the flu. So the death certificate may not have had the flu on it. But in today's terms, that would be almost 2 million people dying within about a 9-month period. So a whole lot of people. It really hit hardest worldwide in September and October. And about 2/3 of the deaths were in about a 6-month period in the fall, and half of those were from mid-September to early December. And the death rate for those who got the flu was 2.5%. Remember that the usual rate is 0.1%, or 1 in 1,000 people who get the flu will die. Here, 25 people who get the flu will die. And when a third of the world is infected and 2.5% of them die, that's a really, that's how the numbers get to be so high. It's just so many people were infected, and it was 25 times more deadly than the usual flu. And this is the average death rate. Some places saw much higher. The US had it better than many places that had a lower death rate. And one of the things that's really striking about the 1918 flu is that a half of the deaths were from people 20 to 40 years old. So these are the people you don't expect to get the flu. You expect, the really young and the very old. I mean, they would get the flu, but not to die from the flu. You'd expect the very young and the very old to die, but not the 20 to 40-year-olds. And so worldwide, this was up to 10% of all young adults. And keep in mind, these are people in the prime of life. They were the breadwinners, they were parents. And so their deaths had a lot of implications beyond the fact that you're losing a loved one. And the reason that we think that the young adults were targeted is the cytokine storm. You may have heard of that with COVID-19, and that was something that also went on back in the 1918 flu pandemic, that the virus really primed and targeted healthy immune systems, and then those immune systems acted far too aggressively, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple of slides. So if you see the dotted line here, the bottom line, this is the typical, even today, the typical, it's called a U-shaped curve, where you can see that the people that are most likely to die are the young, less than, say, 5 years old, and the older, say, 65 or older. And that did also happen in 1918. There was still a lot of young kids who died and some older people who died. But also you see that peak up in the middle where that's the 20 to 40-year-olds. So this is the cytokine storm. And basically what happens with the cytokine, so what happens with the flu is the flu comes in, attacks your lungs, and then it primes your lungs to have secondary infections, which is usually pneumonia. And then your body really, if there's a cytokine storm, overreacts by trying to kill the pneumonia virus or bacteria. And the way that I don't understand all the biology behind it, but what it leaves behind is a lot of debris or byproducts, and that's fluid in the lungs. And so the lungs get filled with fluid. So some people just drowned because there was so much fluid in their lungs. You can imagine that with the lungs are filled with fluid, that it's hard to pump the blood out and get it to the other organs. And so the oxygen that goes with the blood is not getting pumped out of the lungs, and so organs are failing. Heart failure, just because it's having to work extra hard to get the blood out of the lungs. And then exhaustion. We breathe without thinking about it, but we do use muscles to breathe. And they were breathing so rapidly, trying to get in the oxygen, that the muscles became exhausted and they just stopped breathing. And also, I guess suffocation probably fills in with all of these, where they just can't get enough oxygen in, and so they suffocate. So what were the symptoms of the 1918 flu? some people just had the normal, they had the 1918 flu, but the normal symptoms, but a lot of people had some really bad symptoms. And symptoms that were varied enough and extreme enough that doctors at first thought that this was not the flu. So extremely high fever and chills, they thought was malaria. The severe pounding headaches, it had GI symptoms that they thought was cholera. Body ache so intense they felt like the bones were breaking is dengue fever, which is the bone breaker disease. And then one of the unique aspects is the hemorrhagic aspect, that they were coughing up blood. They were having really severe nosebleeds. I actually just recently heard an account where blood was spurting out like 3 to 4 feet away from the nose, bleeding from the ears and from the eyes. So you didn't just die, you died in a really horrible way. And if you survived and experienced, if you coughed up the blood, you probably weren't going to survive. With a lot of these others, you would survive, but you were really, really sick and in a lot of pain while you had the flu. And so Roy Grist was an Army physician at Camp Devens. And for those of you in the Boston area, this is about 30 to 40 miles outside of Boston. So since Boston was the first place hit in the US, Camp Devens was hit pretty hard. It was an Army camp. And so Roy Grist, who's a doctor, said, "These men start with what appears to be an ordinary attack of la grippe, which is another word for the flu, or influenza. And when brought to the hospital, they very rapidly develop the most vicious type of pneumonia that has ever been seen. 2 hours after admission, they have the mahogany spots over the cheekbones. And a few hours later, you can begin to see the cyanosis, which is the skin starting to turn blue due to lack of oxygen, extending from their ears and spreading all over the face. It is only a matter of a few hours then until death comes. Pneumonia means in about all cases, death." And so there's a lot of similarities to COVID. When the flu first came into Boston and then very quickly spread, the government wasn't really sure what to do. Like I said, they weren't even sure that it was the same disease at first because of the varied and very extreme symptoms. And then there was a war going on. We'll talk more about the censorship. And then also they just wanted people not to panic regardless of the war going on. So they wanted to keep morale up, but also you don't want people to panic if it turns out to be nothing. And so there were very mixed messages from the government about whether they needed to worry about this. Most people said, "Oh, it's just the regular flu. You don't need to worry about this." But here are some rules issued by the Surgeon General of the Army. And I pulled these from the newspaper in Winchester, and here's just a few of them. So avoid needless crowding. Influenza is a crowd disease. That makes sense. Smother your coughs and sneezes. Others do not want the germs you would throw away. Also makes sense. Number 5, I'm not really sure about. Try to keep cool when you walk and warm when you ride and sleep. Number 6, open the windows, always at home at night, at the office when practicable, which is good advice because ventilation helps move the virus around and get it out so it's not staying in one place. But this is also October of Boston. It can get kind of cold overnight in October. And then I don't know about this last one. Avoid tight clothes, tight shoes, tight gloves. Seek to make nature your ally, not your prisoner. So you cannot talk about the 1918 flu without talking about the war effort. And a lot of people ask, why is it called the Spanish flu? Is that the same as the 1918 flu? And the answer is yes. Because so with much of Europe and the US at war, they were all having a lot of censorship. So they weren't really writing or talking much about the flu that was impacting their countries and their troops. But Spain was not at war, they were neutral. And so they're like, "Oh yeah, we have the flu and our king has the flu," and they were very open about it. So a lot of people think that it started in Spain, but it didn't. But that's why it's called the Spanish flu. So Woodrow Wilson, who was president at the time, he ran his campaign in 1969 on the slogan that "I kept you out of war," meaning I'm not going to get you into this war. But then he decided that actually we had to go to war. And that was in early 1917. And when he went to war, the entire nation went to war. And he was all in, and all of you had to be all in. And so he said, it's not an army that we must shape and train for war, it is a nation. So with the movement of troops, was helping to spread the disease during that first wave where it was very mild and a lot of people didn't even know that it was a wave. And then also during September, October, there was still a lot of movement in troops. Even when the epidemic was known that it was there and it was dangerous, they were still moving troops around a lot. There was censoring, where John Barry, who wrote The Great Influenza, which is a book that I'd highly recommend, Barry, says that there was more censoring under Wilson during the war than at almost any other time in US history. And he has a whole section of a chapter on that. But with that censoring, you didn't want to let the enemy know that your troops or your citizens were all getting sick from the flu. And so it was very much downplayed, even when it was very clear what was going on. It was very much downplayed in a lot of the newspapers. Oh, it's just the flu, you don't need to worry about it. They wanted to keep morale up. And then Liberty loans were one of the best ways that they could raise money for the war effort. And often these were associated with big parades or big events. And so Boston was supposed to have a Liberty Loan parade in September of 1918. And they decided, with the epidemic going full speed, that was not a good idea, and they canceled it. Philadelphia should have done the same thing, but they didn't. At the end of September, I think it was September 26th or somewhere thereabouts, even though the flu was already in town and Boston was maybe a week or two ahead of them, they saw what was happening in Boston, that hundreds of people were dying every day. They're like, we need to do this, it's fine, it's just the regular flu. Well, within 2 to 3 days, there were hundreds of thousands of people who showed up. And within just a few days, they were in the hospital and dying. And Philadelphia was the hardest hit city in the nation in terms of the number of deaths per capita. So that's kind of all of the background. We'll now get into the stories. Actually, I can't see the chat, Allison, but are there any questions about anything I've talked about so far in the chat?
No questions yet.
Okay, great. We'll keep going then. So I mentioned at the beginning that I'm a social historian and a genealogist, and because of that, stories are important to me because they help tell the stories of our ancestors and of our country. And so Laura Spinney, who wrote a book called Pell Rider, also a very good book about the 1918 flu pandemic, she said, when asked what was the biggest disaster of the 20th century, almost nobody answers the Spanish flu. And the interesting thing is that it had been almost forgotten until the 1990s. Really, nobody talked about it between 1918 and the 1990s. And even though with 50 to 100 million people who died there, more people died of the flu worldwide than died in most, if not all, of the wars in the 20th century. And there were a lot of reasons that people didn't talk about it. One of the more common answers from historians is that the 1918 flu, so the worst of it was in September and October of 1918. So November of 1918, restrictions were starting to be lifted, people were starting to come back outside. The war ended November 11th, 1918, and the war had been really bad, especially in Europe. The pandemic had been really bad everywhere, and people just wanted to move on and not talk about it. So because of that, I think a lot of the stories have not been passed down. And so she goes on to say, the Spanish flu is remembered personally, not collectively, not as a historical disaster, but as millions of discrete private tragedies. And through the rest of this talk, I'm going to use family stories that people have shared with me to talk about the various ways that the flu could impact people. So one is it gave you a susceptibility to other diseases. I mentioned that most people who died didn't die of the flu itself, but died of complications, most often either viral or bacterial pneumonia. So Linda is a professional genealogist. It took years for her to figure out how Hattie Mae finally died. Hattie Mae was, I believe, 38 when she died. She left behind a husband and several children. And she said, half of my family said that Hattie Mae Lane died from influenza. The other half said she died from tuberculosis. When she finally tracked down the death certificate, the cause of death was tuberculosis pulmonosis, or tuberculosis of the lungs, following Spanish influenza about 1 year ago. And she died November 11th, 1919. And so did she get tuberculosis and then it was exacerbated by the flu? Or did she get the flu first and then that open up the lungs to tuberculosis? We don't know which one came first, but certainly the Spanish flu didn't help. Some other diseases that persisted, there was a lot of hearing loss and infection of the ears that may or may not respond. There was a lot of cognitive things that were either short-term or long-term that became as a part of having the flu, one of the complications. Also heart disease. There was one story that was shared with me that I don't have here, where there was I think it was a brother and a sister. They both got the flu, and both of them died within a year or two from heart complications. And so probably their heart had been weakened by their experience with the flu, and then they died from that. There also were other long-term health consequences. Robin said, my grandmother said her hair turned white after she recovered from the flu. She was 28 years old, and it remained white the rest of her life. And some other people have told me that their ancestors, the fevers, and this is probably due to the fever, other people, because of the really high fever, their hair fell out. And sometimes if it had been straight before, it came in curly, or vice versa. So it actually could change your type of hair, surprisingly. And when I started this about 2 or 3 years ago, I asked my parents, do we have any 1918 flu stories? And my family knows a lot of family stories, and both my mom and dad said no. But I found that both my mom and dad do have a flu story. So this one is, the second one on this page is my great-grandmother, and her name was Effie. And she was one of my father's, he loved her. He would actually run down the street. His mom had to tie him to a tree, because that was the only way to keep him from running the quarter mile down the busy road to go see his grandma when he was little. And so ever since he knew her his entire life, she had had really bad hearing loss, but he just thought, all grandmas have bad, or not all, but many grandparents have hearing loss. So it was just a factor of older age. But then we came across this biography by her daughter, Oris, and she said, during the flu epidemic of World War I, Mother had the dreadful disease, which left her with the loss of most of her hearing. This was a real trial to her all her life, but she tried to be cheerful and not dwell on her infirmities. And then just the paralyzing fear. I mean, if you can imagine that you see people, or you hear of people, sometimes you see people, sometimes you hear of people, just having these horrific symptoms, hemorrhaging, coughing up blood, having really bad nosebleeds, losing their hair because the fever's so high, and many of them dying, and that just scares you. And so the next 3 stories that I'm going to tell actually come from the PBS American Experience episode on the 1918 flu, which I really recommend that you watch. And also their website has a lot of other resources, so you can spend some time there if you're interested. But these are people who were interviewed in the 1990s. So they were young children in 1918. So they were being asked to remember really far back, when you were a kid, how did you feel? So Susanna said, the fear in the hearts of people just withered with them. They were afraid to go out, afraid to do anything. You just lived from day to day, did what you had to do, and not think about the future. And then life shut down. So it depended on where you lived, but I'll talk about Boston because that's what I'm most familiar with. Boston did shut down. They were slow to shut down, but they did shut down schools at the end of September for about a month or 6 weeks. In varying degrees, they shut down theaters, salons, saloons, a lot of places, but not all places. Kind of like now with COVID, some places are open and some are not. You don't really understand the difference. They wanted in Boston to shut down the churches, but they didn't, because even though they thought that it was a big health threat, they also realized that these were really, not only was there a war going on, but there's this epidemic. These are very scary times. And people, need that solace from worshiping together. So they encouraged churches to shut down, but did not mandate it. And most churches did shut down or held outdoor services. So this is Dan in North Carolina. He says, we were actually almost afraid to breathe. The theaters were closed down, so you didn't get into any crowds. You couldn't play with your playmates. You had to stay home and just be careful. And think about the impact on children. They don't really, think about today, about COVID. One of my nieces had too much. She was 11. She ate, some junk food. And she woke up in the middle of the night throwing up, and she looked up at her mom with big eyes and said, Mom, am I going to die of COVID? And so if you think about that, they hear about these scary things. They don't completely understand it. They don't understand why they can't play with their playmates, but you just had to stay home and be careful, whatever that means. That life was scary for kids. It was scary for adults because they worried that they or their families might get it. And life was shut down. And many of us have experienced that with COVID. And extended families were affected. So Janine had got this photo, and I always, when I'm talking to genealogists, I always ask them, what's the first thing you do? The first thing that I think you should do when you get a photo is turn it over and see what's on the back. Does it tell you where this picture was taken or who these people are? And so it did, but it also said 4 people in Hooksett, New Hampshire died in the 1918 flu epidemic. Pepere, or grandfather, Racine, Uncle Philip, Aunt Eva, and Aunt Blanche's fiance, Rudy LaSalle. So Arthur, the grandfather, died in January of 1919. He was 59. His son Philip died within a few days. He was 23. And his daughter Eva had died a couple months earlier. She was 29. She was married and had a little girl. And luckily for her little girl, Eva's sister took her in and raised her as her own, which is very unusual, at least among the stories that I've collected. Usually they're either given out to orphanages or taken to other family members who let them know that they are a burden and that they are not their own. And then another family member lost her fiance and never married. And then this is in the Appalachians. This is the autobiography of Ida. So she said, then came the War of 1918 that took a lot of young boys. And then came the flu that killed so many people. The flu broke out and people was dying like flies, and no one was able to bury them for days. Just think of the public health implications of that. This was out in the country, but in Philadelphia and other places, the bodies would just pile up in the morgue, or maybe on the streets, on the porches. There were not enough caskets. So my mother and me, Ida Stevens, took the flu and almost died. No one thought we'd make it. We were so bad. We lived on the knoll overlooking Lawton. We could overlook the place and see caskets set a long time before anyone could come and get them. Again, public health implications. And then this is a diary by Charles, and he lived in Waterbury, Connecticut. And so he wrote on Sunday, October 20th, 1918, meetings at the Hill Plain Chapel are postponed until further notice on account of the influenza. No meetings were held in any of the churches in Waterbury today. Irving called last night, having just come from Calvary Cemetery, where about 30 men are employed with about 20 other men, so 50 men, in digging graves for the dead. He said that at dark there were still 9 adults and 2 infants yet unburied. Most of them were buried side by side in a huge trench. There are so many to be buried. And so if you can imagine, 50 men had been burying people all day in a trench, not even in their own plots, and there were still some left at night that were not buried. So many people were dying, and they just could not keep up with it in terms of caskets, in terms of mortuaries, in terms of cemeteries. A week later, he wrote, no service in any of the Protestant churches in Waterbury today on account of the influenza. Over 500 people have died with it thus far this month. Last Monday, so just a day after the previous entry we just read, the U.S. Employment Bureau sent out to all the factories for 100 men to dig graves in the Calvary Cemetery. So not only could they not keep up with the burials, but also the way that people said goodbye to their loved ones changed. Just like during, at least here in Boston, during the height of COVID, people could not say goodbye to their loved ones who were in the hospital. People could not go to the funeral home and mourn there. Only immediate family and very small immediate family could go to the cemeteries. And so it was, not only was it hard for those who died, of course, it was hard for those who were living because they couldn't say goodbye in the way that they were used to. And then this is a hearse driver who talks about that he drove the Haynes on 2 local funerals today, and influenza and pneumonia are taking them off fast, and this is October 26th. And we talked about that you can't talk about the 1918 flu without talking about the war effort. And the war effort took precedence. In John Barry's book, he mentions that the commanders of the army over in Europe kept saying, we need more men, we need more men. And he said, and he was thinking, but if I send the men over during the height of the epidemic, they're gonna catch it, they're gonna spread it among themselves, catch it on the way over and die, or take it over and spread it to more people and more people will die. And he was right, but in the end, I think John Barry sounded like it made it very hard for him, but in the end, he sent the men over. And so Nora says, my mother was born in 1917 and had 3 older siblings. So my grandmother caught the flu and she had a 1-year-old, 2 6-year-olds, and an 8-year-old. My grandfather was a passenger agent for the railroad and had to keep working to keep troops moving. So my great uncle stayed with grandma and cared for her. This was in Cincinnati. Grandma survived. And then let's talk a little bit about military life. So this is Floyd West. He was a medical tech at Camp Devens. Remember that Camp Devens had it really, really bad. There were at the height of the epidemic, hundreds of people were dying per day, and he was taking care of them. And so you can only imagine the horror that he saw. I've talked with you about some of the symptoms. Another symptom that I didn't talk about is that some people, there would be a lot of pockets of air that developed just under the skin. So when you rolled people over, it sounded like you were like Rice Krispies. So he saw a lot of horrible things. And in the end, he actually probably did get the flu. Through the fall, he was fine. But he was, in April, I think, he received a medical discharge because his lungs were just too affected, likely from the flu, for him to be able to do his work. And so his grandson, Bill wrote, "Some soldiers in World War I saw hell on a battlefield. Others, such as my grandfather, saw another sort of hell in hospital wards full of comrades racked with the Spanish influenza." And there were many that died in the US Army camps, either here or across the ocean. This was just one of them, Leslie. He enlisted June 24th, he died October 7th. He never left the US. And a newspaper article says, "Another sacrifice of life has been laid on the altar of the country in the death of Leslie Kors, a young farmer soldier of Milo Township, October 7th. He was stricken by illness when he was expecting to be sent to service abroad. His end brings another sorrow of war." Also, there were other aspects of the flu. So here's where a ship sinks due to the flu. So this is Clyde Pendleton. He was a gunner on the USS America, and not on the boat, but sometime when he was stateside, his granddaughter's not sure when, he did catch the flu because he was in a hospital stateside. He survived. But the story about the USS America is that it had come to Boston in the middle of September it was a transport ship. So it had come to Boston to pick up Army troops to take them over to France. Really, really, really bad time to be picking up soldiers in Boston. But the war must go on, and so they did. I forgot to look up the numbers, but many people, I think a few hundred got infected and about 50 died, if I remember right. And so when they took the troops over, they probably brought some troops back. But once they were back, they decided they needed to fumigate the ship, which was a good idea. And it doesn't say exactly what they used, but you can imagine it was a pretty sharp smelling caustic agent. And so they wanted to air out the boat. And so they opened up, I'm not a boat person, but they opened up the doors or the ports or the windows, whatever is on the lower part of the ship, and during low tide. And when the tide started rising, the ship was sunk in the mud and it didn't rise with the tide evenly. So water started coming in through all of the open ports and windows, and the ship sunk. So this picture here is when they're trying to pull it up. And the nurses were such an important part, and many, many of them died. So this is Miss Frances Poole. And so when, in Boston and very quickly throughout the rest of the country, as people realized what was going on with the flu and they needed nurses, there was this call for nurses. At first it was for trained nurses, but there really weren't that many because most of them are already serving in the Army. And so then they're like, you know, anyone who can take care of people will take. And so a lot of people volunteered. And so this is Miss Frances Poole, and she was from Evanston, Illinois. And she was fairly well-to-do. She didn't have to do this, but she wanted to do, you know, right for the country and to volunteer for the country. And so she volunteered, and she died in New York of pneumonia following influenza. And this is what one of her colleagues wrote. During the terrible epidemic, which was very severe in Camp Ontario, Miss Poole did not spare herself, and though she had a severe cold and was urged not to go on duty, she saw the extreme need of the boys and like a brave soldier fought the fight until she fell, a victim of pneumonia. Her mother reached her 2 hours before her death, bringing by her presence the greatest joy to her daughter that she could have had at the last. So there were many people like Frances who volunteered. Some died, a few were kidnapped because they could do what the doctors couldn't. So there was no treatment. There was no Tamiflu, there were no ventilators, there were no antibiotics, there was no vaccine. There was nothing that the doctors could do in ways that we think today would be helpful. They tried, and like they were very dedicated. They tried, they just didn't have the tools that we had today. But nurses could help more because they could provide the care that would let the patients rest. They could provide the nourishing food, they could take care of them so they could just lie and try to get better, which is really the best thing you could do back then. And so this is Louise. She enlisted as a nurse in the Army Nurse Corps. So that was a professional nursing organization. She enlisted on September 30th. She died of pneumonia October 14th, only 2 weeks later. And then this is some funeral service papers from a funeral service for the Wyeth Funeral Home. So this is Ethel Gertrude Hitchens. She died September 19th, 1918 in a Cambridge hospital. She was 31 years old. She was married. She was a nurse. And she died of influenza and bronchial pneumonia. So keep in mind that she was working. Her husband, we can assume, may have been working. Oh, no, sorry, no, she was widowed. So she was the sole breadwinner for her, and if she had kids, for her family. But the cost of dying was high. The casket was $135. Removal from the hospital cost, removal from North Station, so actually being put on the train at North Station in Boston to go to wherever she was going to be buried. The total of that for her came to $200, which is roughly, as of at least 2 years ago, was about over $3,000. So not only was this breadwinner dying, it was really expensive to bury her as well. And you can only imagine about, you know, her family and all of the, not just the financial costs, but all of the other costs of losing someone that you love. And many doctors died too, because again, even though they didn't have a lot that they could do, they tried. They really did try. So Helga says, my great-grandfather, Dr. Samuel Baker, went to New York to help those who had contracted influenza, and he caught it and passed away from it. In his book, John Barry says that on September 17th, 5 doctors and 14 nurses at a hospital in Philadelphia collapsed. They had exhibited no prior symptoms. And so it was rare that you could, and I don't know if these people died or not, he just said that they collapsed. Some of them may have died, or they may have all survived. But one of the things with the flu is, although most people, if you were going to die from the flu, you would survive for a few days or even weeks and then you would die. But a few people would leave in the morning healthy and then be dead before night. So that was also scary. And then JAMA is the Journal of the American Medical Association, and they have obituaries in the back. So I just selected randomly an issue of the end of October, and there were 3 pages of obituaries, just so many obituaries. They were all short, and so there were a lot of doctors on these pages that died in that week, and most of them died from influenza. And then on the other hand, some opportunities were opened, but at great cost. So this is Marion Dakin, and she lost her husband, her mother, and her 10-month-old son in a matter of days from each other. So this article says the death of Robert Dakin occurred at his home in Danbury Sunday morning after 3 weeks of illness of pneumonia following an attack of influenza. The death of Mr. Dakin was the 3rd to occur in his family within a week. On Monday, his mother-in-law, who had gone to Danbury to help take care of him, contracted pneumonia and died. And the following day, the 10-month-old son died as well. And so here's poor Marion. She has one surviving son.